Hello, my name is Victor and welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I want to talk about the Fed's decision to cut the rates by 1/4 percentage point. And it is exactly what I predicted in my previous video. And I listened to Jerome Powell's speech in its entirety so that you don't have to, and I came away from it with 3 key takeaways. Starting off with, it looks like on top of the 1/4 basis point cut today, they're expecting or they're projecting another 2 cuts for the remainder of 2025. It looks like the other 2 cuts will total 0.5%, which is a very cautious approach by the Fed. In my previous video, I had talked about how if Jerome Powell and the Fed had decided to cut rates more aggressively, that would be a sign that they were in a panic because of the lowering jobs in the United States right now. But it doesn't seem to be the case that they are in a panic mode of any kind. Besides kind of looking a little shaky there at the beginning of his speech, he sounded like he had to clear his throat all the time, and he did seem a little bit nervous at the start. But as his speech went on, it seemed like he got his bearings and was able to finally get that scratch out of his throat there towards the end. All in all, I would say that he was ultimately dovish. Now, he did have a couple of things that he did mention that kind of shook up the stock market a little bit, and we'll talk about the market here at the end of the video. But for now, just know that for me, he seemed very dovish. He kept saying how, inflation seems to be under control. The jobs market, for the most part, is looking pretty solid. But the one thing he did mention was tariffs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move on to my next takeaway here, and that is the second takeaway that I took from Jerome Powell today, and that is that the Fed is prioritizing the cooling job market over inflation. Jerome Powell even mentioned that by the end of 2025, he expects the inflation rate to be at about 3%. And by the end of 2027, he expects the inflation rate to be at 2.1%, which is virtually where the Fed wants to be at, because they like for the inflation rate to be right at 2%. And it seems to me that with the inflation rate under control, now the Fed is going to pivot here and focus on the jobs which have not been growing as much as expected. And just like I mentioned before, Jerome Powell mentioned tariffs a ton throughout his speech. He mentioned how he expects inflation to creep up a little bit initially because of the tariffs, but ultimately it should cool down over time. At least that is the expectation, but there is no guarantee, and I think that is what initially spooked the stock market, because everything seemed to be very dovish. He seemed to be saying everything looks good, but then as soon as he mentioned those tariffs, the stock market seemed to take a little bit of a tumble. And we're not exactly at the end of the trading day here, but all in all, it seems like for the most part, everything is business as usual with the stock market. There are a couple of trends here that I have noticed. And right off the bat, the very first thing that came to mind was the Magnificent Seven, which either didn't really move much at all or are down after Jerome Powell's speech. And I also just want to highlight here, Nvidia is the stock that is losing the most ground today. And the reason for that is because China seems to be ramping up regarding their potential ban on US AI chips, which is not good news for Nvidia or AMD for that matter. Having a look at the chart here, it looks like AMD is also down about 1% today. So if Nvidia goes down, AMD goes down with it. But I also want to highlight that there was a lot of green on this chart. And for me, there are 2 things that come to mind here. Number 1 is it could be an example of selling the news. And the reason that this happens is because the stock market is forward looking. For the most part, everybody knew that there would be a 95% or so guarantee that the Fed was going to lower rates. So for the last couple of weeks, it seems like the stock market has been climbing and climbing. Why? In anticipation of the Fed cutting rates. So now that we have the news or the actual event that has occurred, some people just take the gains and go about their day. But number 2, and what I think is most likely happening here, is it may be a rotation out of the larger cap stocks and into these smaller cap stocks. But I want to hear from you. What do you make of Jerome Powell and the Fed's cautious approach to cutting rates? Do you think they should be cutting rates faster because of the weakening job market? Or do you think Jerome Powell is right in being a little bit cautious because of all of the tariffs and all of the uncertainty? But as always, thank you to everybody who has made it until this point in the video. Be sure to give me a like, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.